I was an exchange student studying in China in 1989, so I'm very, very excited to be able to introduce our next speaker. I think most of us here may not recognize her, but we certainly recognize her voice. I'm here to introduce Louisa Lim to talk about her book, The People's Republic of Amnesia. She is the voice, as I said, from China for National Public Radio, or has been, and prior to that, she worked for BBC. And over a decade or so of reporting, she's earned many prestigious prizes and broadcasting awards for her work. During the previous academic year, 2013 to 2014, Louisa was a Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan, and I just learned that for the next academic year, she will be teaching at the University of Michigan in the journalism school. For me, reading her book brought back to me a flood of memories from my year in China, and especially the events that surrounded Tiananmen. Having been in China around that time, I found a recent quote in the Wall Street Journal about her book to be especially relevant. In that article, Professor Benjamin Reed said her depictions, and this is where I quote, "enhance our sense of the human costs of suppressing the past, of dulling the young's understanding of the world and capacity for critical thought, of severing people from a homeland that they yearn for, and of trying to pretend that none of it is happening." So with that, please join me in welcoming Louisa Lim.
Thank you so much to David Mao for that introduction, and thank you to the Library of Congress for this incredible opportunity and this wonderful book festival. I'm here to talk about my book, The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited. And it's really about how the events of 1989 changed China, and how China then changed the events of 1989 as it rewrote its own history. It's about amnesia, which one very famous Chinese author, Yan Lianke, called a state-sponsored sport. And my book is about those people who refuse to play in this state-sponsored sport, those who refuse to forget what happened. My story really started with one woman, a mother, and I met her actually by chance. I was working in Beijing as NPR's correspondent, and I was sent to Chengdu on a completely different story, and I just met her by chance, and her name is Tang Deying, and we met in this sort of shiny new apartment block in this sort of brand new part of the city. But she was almost like a throwback from another time. She was in her 60s, she's a very small woman. She's like an old school, dispossessed peasant farmer shuffling around in flip-flops, smelling of garlic with an incredibly strong accent. But when she began talking, I discovered that this was a very uniquely determined woman. And she was the one who really put me on the path towards this book, because she told me how she had lost her 17-year-old son on June the 6th, 1989, in Chengdu. She said he'd disappeared riding his bike back home, and he was killed in the crackdown. And I said, well, what crackdown? And she said, oh, well, you know, there was a crackdown in Chengdu as well. And I hadn't known that. So that was the thing that started me on this trail, because I wanted to find out more. So I started to look for other accounts. I started to look for eyewitnesses, for people who had been in Chengdu 25 years ago, who had taken photos, who'd written diaries. And I started to look for Chinese propaganda accounts and US diplomatic cables. And piece by piece, I tried to piece all of these different pieces together. And I discovered this completely forgotten story, that there had been a crackdown in Chengdu as well, that in 1989, while the demonstrations were going on in Beijing, they were also going on all over the country. In Chengdu, hundreds of thousands of people had taken to the streets. And after people died in Beijing, people also died in Chengdu at the hands of government forces and acknowledged by the government. And that sort of brought up the real central question that I was tackling. How is it possible that an event like this that happened 25 years ago within living memory, how can it be forgotten? How can it be deleted from the collective memory? And that was when I realized one thing, that memory depends on geography. So here in the West, when we talk about Tiananmen and about 1989, it invariably brings to mind the one iconic image, and I've brought it along as a visual aid, Tank Man, this skinny man in the white shirt carrying his 2 plastic bags, standing up to the power of the state. This is an image that is so iconic that, in fact, a play has recently been written, Chimerica, about this image, and the playwright Lucy Kirkwood wrote in it, "This is a picture of the moment that China exchanged democracy for an economic miracle, for the opportunity to live, work, spend, progress." Now, I just wanted to do a quick experiment. Raise your hand if you have seen this picture before. That's almost everyone in the room. I mean, okay, raise your hand if you haven't seen this picture. So I would say that's probably 98% of people in this room have seen this picture. And it has become such a well-known image that it's been used in The Simpsons. There was even a Chick-fil-A advert that used this image. Hard to believe, but it's true. So it's become really part of our popular culture. But what I wanted to know was, how well-known is this image in China? After all, we read an awful lot about the power of the internet to break down the control of information. We know China has 642 million internet users, and I wanted to know if they also knew about 1989 and could recognize this picture. So when I was working in Beijing, I did this very crude experiment. I went to 4 universities in Beijing, and I took this picture around on the campus, and there were 4 universities whose students had really been most instrumental in 1989. And I asked students there, you know, do you know what this picture is? And if they said yes, I said, well, tell me. And I was surprised to find only 15% of Chinese students knew what this picture was, compared to, 98% of people in this room. I think, to me, that really shows the success of the state in expunging this whole episode from its history and continuing to block access to information about it. It was a pretty crude experiment, but it was also quite interesting because I discovered really quickly that it was very effective. Before I went, I thought, well, maybe I won't be able to tell if people are lying to me, but I discovered that the power of this image is such that those people who knew what it was had almost a visceral, physical reaction to the picture. They would see it, and they would shy away from it. They might gasp. One man said, "Oh my God." But this was only a small proportion of the students. Most of the students, the 85% who had no idea, they would not shy away from this image. They would lean in to try and look at the details. And there was no flicker of recognition on their faces. And they would ask me questions. So one student, a PhD student, asked me, "Is it South Korea?" An astronomy major asked me, "Is it Kosovo?" 19 students believed that this was a picture of a military parade. That's more students than those who actually knew what it was. And of those students that did recognize it, it was interesting that quite a lot really defended the government. They said what the government did was necessary, and China would be much worse off today if the government had acted any differently. So it was really a retrospective justification based on China's phenomenal growth rate over the past 30 years. And I think that is a very mainstream view, even among some of those that went out and protested in 1989. And for me personally, this experiment was also very interesting because I suddenly realized how nervous I was when I was on those campuses asking those questions. If you bear in mind, at this point, I'd already been a reporter based in China for 10 years, so I'd done an awful lot of kind of sneaking around and dressing up as a peasant and trying to sneak into areas past police checkpoints in